Børge, BRENDE. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for grabbing your coffees, grabbing your drinks. This is quite a critical session and one that I'm quite honored with the people who are joining us both virtually and also here in person. Hybrid's the way we go, as we have learned, and it works wonderfully well when we want a rounded conversation. What are we going to talk about for the next hour and a half or so? We're going to talk about sustaining global cooperation towards climate neutrality. It echoes the conversation that we had at the opening lunch of the MSC. And the one thing I am going to do is remind everyone standing in the corner, the session has begun, folks. So the conversations are fantastic. But it's time to have a seat and aim your conversations towards the stage, because this is going to continue to be an interactive session. The folks who are still downstairs, if you can hear me, wander on up, because this conversation is not one to be missed. The most important thing we're going to talk about is the climate energy security nexus. We've been touching on it all morning. Let's talk a little bit more about how we resolve that. We're going to talk about founding new socio-economic systems. I know the conversations we had just before this alluded to that. How do we do it? Do it in a secure way where we don't leave the developing countries behind. I'm going to invite our guests onto stage, the ones who are joining us in person. Børge BRENDE is the president of the World Economic Forum. He's been doing that job for about 4 years or more. He's been shaping the WEF's overall agenda, strategy and day-to-day operation. And of course, before joining WEF as president, he held several roles as a minister in the Norwegian government, including Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2013 to 2017. So he's lived through previous Russian acts before. During his professional term, he has devoted his attention to the improvement of the livelihoods of people, humanitarian action, and nature conservation. Also joining us here in person is Meghan O'Sullivan. She is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and the Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. She has extensive experience in policy formulation and negotiation, and between 2004 and 2007, she was Special Assistant to President George W. Bush and Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. Her expertise includes the geopolitics of energy, American foreign policy, and the Middle East. Joining us virtually is Chengyu, chairman of the China Petroleum and Chemical Corporation. He has been in that role since 2011. Previously, he worked as CEO and chairman of the China National Offshore Oil Corporation. With more than 40 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, Mr. Fu is recognized as one of the most crucial figures for the sector's green transition. He was also a sitting member of the board of the UN Global Compact and continues his work as honorary chairman of the UN Global Compact Network in China. We also have Tanja, GÖNNER, chairwoman of the management board of the German Corporation for International Cooperation, who's also joining us virtually. Tanja was appointed the chair in 2012, so she's been in her role for a good decade and brings a whole lot of expertise to this conversation. In her role, she has spearheaded the internal sustainability efforts and is responsible for the operational, business and strategic planning of the federal authority. Before joining us, Tanja was senior ministerial. She had so many ministerial roles. I'm going to stop right here because that might just be the entirety of our time for the panel. Before we get started, though, I do want to make a note that David Malpass, the president of the World Bank, was supposed to be part of this session. Unfortunately, as things happen at the MSC, something came up, so he's unfortunately not going to be joining us. One more note, we have some news out of Ukraine that has still not hit the news wires. We want some details that, well, we're going to get some details in this room that we might actually get ahead of people at the MSC. So if I could ask Galina Mikhailuk to please give us an update on what's happening in Ukraine. You are a member of parliament. For our panelists who don't know you, you're a member of parliament in Ukraine. What is the situation? What have you learned in the last just an hour and a half or so?
Well, as I told you during our panel, that yesterday President of Ukraine asked MPs to go on the front line because of escalation. And just recently I've got information that our MPs went to the front line, the head of our faction, the head of National Defense Committee, and other MPs, and they appear to be under the Russian military attack. Well, all of them, they're alive, but well, they went through this. Secondly, Lufthansa cancelled all the flights to Ukraine starting from tomorrow, so my flight is cancelled, and I think I will not make it to come to BMW Foundation tomorrow, as all the Ukrainian delegation will need somehow to find their way how to get home. Secondly, while we had our panel, I've got information from our office, like dear MP, in case of escalation and in case of satellite will be cut off, etc., you are kindly asked to immediately proceed to your office in the parliament because some important decisions should be adopted. And there was also a question to me about the unity within the parliament between the opposition and monomajority. And those colleagues who were present during our Ukrainian lunch, they can witness that there were statements given by the pro-presidential faction, opposition faction, and opposition told that we completely agree with the statements of monomajority. So there is unity and no other talks about that Ukraine is not consolidated, that there are some internal problems. No, we are united in this special period of our life. And remember that peace in Ukraine today means peace in the whole world and Europe in particular today. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Galina. Thank you for the update. It's something that newswires will probably run in the next hour or two. But when you have someone who's living the ordeal here, it is a good starting point for our discussion. Where, ladies and gents, we've been talking about energy crisis, what Europe will do in terms of Ukraine, what we need to do in terms of balancing that with climate change. How do we deal with crises that develop on a daily basis in different fronts, whether it's in the southern part of the world, whether it's the Sahel, or whether it is an economic crisis in developed countries, or whether it's a situation where we are being held hostage in some ways in tank diplomacy. So if I can get you to give me your opening thoughts of how do we globally cooperate when we're still trying to figure out what that actually means for us individually. If I can start with you, Meghan.
Sure, great, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be with all of you this afternoon and to be here in Munich. I'd like to make a few opening comments about the geopolitics of the energy transition. And I think it's reasonable for people to feel comfortable when they think about the geopolitics of a net zero world. So think about what the world looks like when we are successful. I say when, and that's a little bit hopeful. And I think we can feel like a lot of the uncomfortable dependencies that have gone with the world of fossil fuels and the tensions that have gone with the world of fossil fuels will be dissipated. But the reality is, and I'm really pleased that this conference over the last couple of days has really focused on this in a number of ways. The reality is that the transition itself, the decades, the next 2.5 decades, until we get to this more idealized world, is going to be one of great volatility. There are going to be many disruptions. It is going to be anything but smooth. And that, of course, is partially because climate change, the warming climate itself, will bring all kinds of new areas of tension and conflict. And also because of the transition itself, that the actual steps that countries and companies and individuals will take in order to advance decarbonization, or, depending on your perspective, to thwart or stall decarbonization, are in themselves going to change the geopolitical landscape. And so I think the question isn't, are we going to have a smooth transition? I'm over that, I guess I would say. I'm accepting of the fact it's not going to be a smooth transition. And the question really is, can we, through international cooperation, shave off the jagged edges of this transition? Can we make it more manageable, less costly? And again, this is really where the international cooperation piece comes in. There are many things that we can talk about. I'm just going to mention a few that are areas that really will require international cooperation if we're going to get through this transition. And again, I'm focusing really on the geopolitics of this transition. The first is in managing volatility. And I think we've all become more aware of this watching Europe and really looking at the energy landscape right now, is that there is something that this volatility is going to be inherent in the transition. And I'm talking about volatility and energy prices as we move into different energy areas, but just remaking the foundations of the global economy. Oh.
We do have some technical issues going on, but hopefully that's just the MSC talking over us.
No, that's okay. I thought for a second we were getting a more urgent update than my comments, which is fine. So the volatility, again, something that's going to have to be managed because we are going to go through periods where investment in the old forms of energies is insufficient to meet the demand, and the investment in new clean energy is insufficient to meet the demand. And we're actually in one of these spots now, and we see how it is empowering, in this case, Russia. In future cases, it could be other traditional producers of fossil fuels. There's also going to be a real requirement to manage conflict here, because conflict there will be many nodes in which conflict is inflamed by the transition. Many of you will be aware that the 15 most vulnerable countries to climate change, almost half of them actually have a UN peacekeeping force in them right now. So you have the most vulnerable countries to climate change, the ones that have the least resilience in their institutions, also being the ones most likely to suffer the effects of climate change. And this is where climate change will be a threat multiplier, meaning it makes conflict more likely in situations where there are already conditions which sort of beckon conflict. Thirdly, we might talk about critical minerals. This is an area I've talked a lot about this. I've heard a lot of people talk about it in the last couple of days. These are the minerals upon which the energy transition is going to be dependent. And we know, in fact, that the world is currently producing a small fraction of the amount that will be needed to make a successful energy transition. So we can see how this will be a source of competition, maybe conflict, if there's not more international coordination around it. And then finally, I'll just mention inclusivity. So past energy transitions have been ones where there haven't been people who are looking out for those who are left out of the transition, and they can be brutal in terms of exacerbating inequality. And we're certainly likely to experience a similar thing unless there is a real focus on how the transition can be one which brings the developing world alongside. And so it's not just the developed world that makes a successful green transition, but it is more of the global community. That is certainly not an inclusive list, but it is enough, I'm sure, to get us started in looking for ways in which we can address these problems more particularly.
If I can give the floor to you, Børge, in this scenario, as Glenn just highlighted, we're dealing with an issue that's immediate, and we're talking about climate, which is also immediate. How do you choose? I think that's what we've been debating all morning. How do you pick which battles to fight right now, which ones that you need to sell the hearts and minds of people to, and which ones you put aside till next year or the year after that?
Well, thank you. It seems like squaring a circle, doesn't it? How to give access to 700 million people on our planet that don't have access to basic electricity, and at the same time decouple this from increased CO2 emissions. So at least the discussion has moved from a discussion about why to how. And I think if we met here 10 years ago and I said that the price of solar would have fallen to 1/10 and the price of wind energy would have fallen to 1/7, I don't think many would have believed that. It did happen. So a part of the solution when it comes to net zero is also new technology breakthroughs. But there's also a long low-hanging fruits there available that we have to make a priority of. And let's not forget that cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. But at the same time, no, we are facing the first kind of energy crisis in a time of the green revolution. And this has to be handled because without electricity or energy, no development, but it has to be a different energy than we have been used to. But it is also the most fundamental change that we have been facing for decades, maybe for a century, to go from a fossil fuel-based society to a society where fossil fuel is not playing the same role. Of course, you can have breakthroughs in carbon capture and storage where that can be also available to competitive prices and etc. And it is the CO2 emissions that is harmful when it comes to fossil fuel. But we also have made huge positive advances during the last years. Just look at the situation when it comes to the private sector. If you only go back 1 year, we have seen 3 times more companies that have now committed globally to a net zero. If you looked at the outcome from COP26 in Glasgow, I think now it's about 73% of emissions are now covered by net zero ambitions, and it is 131 countries that have committed to this. So we are facing a big difference, and we also have seen that private sector has also taken a lot of initiatives and are leading. During COP26, the World Economic Forum, together with President Biden and Secretary Kerry, launched this new First Movers Coalition. We brought together the big purchasers of the world, the Amazons, Apples of the world. We have now 50 Fortune 200 companies that have committed to green their supplies chain, and they will only buy from companies that are also reducing their CO2 footprint. Mm-hmm. This is not a CO2 tax, but it is indirectly putting pressure on the suppliers, so it has partly the same effect. So it's really about now internalizing the externalities. We have to start to set the price on what also climate change is leading to. But as we started with, how do we do this and solve the triangle of energy security, that is on top of the agenda? No. Energy access, and then this decoupling piece. And that triangle we have to take very seriously. Rome wasn't built in a day, but I think we have made more changes during the 2-3 last years than we have done in decades. So medium, long term, I'm quite optimistic. Short term, I think we will be faced with some setbacks due to the current geopolitical crisis.
Mr. Fu, on that note, if I can ask you, Børge brings up a good point. COP26, one of the biggest statements out of COP was the whole debate about phase down and not phase out. You're living this transition right now. From your perspective, what is it that the Chinese economy and your company and the green transition require for it to be done at the pace that is required for the planet, leaving aside Western politics or the demands of, positioning yourselves or juxtapositioning yourselves against policymakers that you may be agreeing, disagreeing about some other issues with? What is it that you need so that that phase down phrase, by the time we get maybe not to Sharm el-Sheikh, but maybe a year or 2 or 3 down the line, can be phase out?
Actually, I'm not look at this as a phase down. And because I look at this as a more reality. And people think should be more aggressive. However, you must be realistic. How to make it happen, how to make your commitment is easier to make. However, how you can really deliver, you need to, when you deliver, you need to make a balance of the economic growth, people's jobs, affordability of the people, and the transformation of the traditional energy and the forming up of the new energy system. So this all need time. And if we have a better understanding of the real situation we are facing, we need to make practical the progress being made gradually and in the first few years. And all the people, all the governments, all the business industries, they need to be prepared for the next 5, 10, 20 years, not just make a lip service, say we can do it immediately. There's related with financing capacity, related with policy issues, related with technologies, related with the awareness of all the people. So you see that a lot of the countries, they did not make a consensus between the governments, between the peoples, between the industries. So we need the strong leadership of each countries to make active and actions together. And also we need to collaborate between the countries. But after COP26, we did not see much actions by the government, especially in terms of the cooperation. But each of them, I think they are thinking how they can make a better job by themselves, especially after the price soaring of energy due to the loss, the cold winter, or in certain areas like in Europe, all the price of the resources are soaring, and that make people really rethinking how we are more realistic to, by one hand, we compete, we are tackling the climate change, and also we make the reality of the people's living. So this, I think, give us some time to re-look at what we should do in the next 10 to 20 years. And the first few years, especially in China, we are preparing for the big advancement next 5 or 10 years, more, not this 1 or 2 years. And because a lot of things we are not fully understand what will happen if we do something else. And so how we can dealing with those new challenges that are coming out. So this is something that I think from China, what we are doing, we think we are trying to better understanding the real situation facing us and the new challenges will coming out, how we're going to dealing with those things. I think China now setting up a whole set of the measures from the government policies, from the finance, the technology areas, the industry areas, and the researchers. So the concerted action must be working together. So I believe, even though there's a great challenges to China, because we are one of the largest emitter, this is tremendous challenge, a lot of challenges we may not exactly realize today. So this is something we need to have a full preparedness. But and even though we see the great challenges, because we are the largest industry scale, we are making the whole world a factory, but we need to deal with all those emissions by ourselves. We also need to take to make economic growth currently we have above the GDP per capita is about $10,000. But when the Western country meet their peak, there actually is $40,000. So that means we need continue to grow our economy, continues to need more energy by 2060 when we committed to carbon neutrality. Our electricity needs will be double or triple.
Mr. Fu, I get that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude or interrupt. I know this is a hybrid situation, so I do apologize for interrupting you. I do want to get a reaction from Børge, because I know he wanted to respond to a couple of comments you made. And then Tanja, I want to get your position as well, and how do we help countries like China, India, and others who are still on the periphery of this conversation, wondering exactly what Mr. Fu said. How do we support them, and how are you doing that? But first I want to go to Børge.
Thank you. I looked at you, but I didn't really ask for the floor, but I'm happy to comment on it. I think it is...
I take hints very well.
Yeah. So there is, of course, very positive when G2, China and US can come together, even in the polarized world. We saw at the end in Glasgow when Secretary Kerry and Climate Envoy Minister Che agreed on a text. And I think both the countries do have so strong common interest in handling climate change that they saw the necessity of securing a deal. And the deal was not that bad. You know, before Paris, we were on a 4 degrees track. After Paris, we were on a 3 degrees track. After Glasgow, maybe 2 or a little bit less if we implement what we have agreed. And China is critical. Xi Jinping has set this net zero target for 2060. China is, for example, today, 40% of the global wind capacity is in China. At the same time, we know also that the future growth has to decouple from coal, or you have to have a major breakthrough in carbon capture and storage, as I mentioned. So the future of climate is, of course, decided in the big nations like US, India, and China. And there are some low-hanging fruits out there too, as I mentioned. I'm not then referring to any particular nations here, but you know, it is a fact that many nations still use a lot of their state budget to subsidize heavy fossil fuel. I think that's a good idea to just don't continue that. Those money should be invested in something else. We also know that still, when climate change is so serious, we should not see net logging. I think the trees can play a very major role, at least in the medium term, until we have further breakthroughs in energy.
I think that's an interesting perspective to go back to Mr. Fu on, but first I'm going to get Tanja into this conversation, whether anyone likes it or not. Tanja, give me an idea of how do you support China, the Chinas, the Indias, the Togos of the world to make sure that their transition, their sustainability factor is not hit. How do you do that from where you're sitting? And an interesting question came up in one of our the MSC opening lunch as well, is about what we need to do in the West to make a China or an India move a little bit quicker is sharing our intellectual property of the technology that we develop, and that, of course, falls into a whole different ballgame of political issues. So give me an idea of what you're doing from a German government perspective.
Well, thank you so much, and also thank you to the BMW Foundation for that kind invitation for this exciting panel. Maybe I will start with the first thing. Yes, we are in an exchange and in a cooperation with countries like China and also India, especially India. There we support the government in thinking about how to realize plans for building up an energy solution road, a path to green energy. there we support India. On one hand, with financing by KfW, and on the other hand, in the question, how could be a plan successful? How should the implementation of such plans could happen? The delivery, as Mr. Fu said. So that's how we could, I think, support countries like China or India. But to be honest, China and India are far more in front than a lot of developing countries. That means low-income countries, and we have to think that there we have two things to have in mind. On one hand, at a lot of especially low-income countries, we have clear that there is a connection between climate change and security issues. We have a lot of low-income countries who have now, who are very fostered by the climate change, and the question is they have no access to energy, and on the other hand, they have to deal with the changes of the climate change. And this is what we have to have in mind if we discuss about that. And to give you how we try to support the countries there, I can give you some examples, because we have in that country, we have, for example, conflicts about resources. Look at the Lake Chad region, where we have also fertility hotspots like Darfur, or various geopolitical challenges in the Middle East. And this means that we have to have clear that climate-induced security risks jeopardize development gains from the least decades, as we currently see, for example, in Mali. And therefore, we try with our approaches, I will say, three main things. That means mainstreaming climate policy in development in economic cooperation, because it's key in order to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Second, climate policy can be a stabilizer, and that's what we have to see. Potential conflict drivers such as water scarcity or crop losses can be addressed by involving fragile states in international climate policy. And the third, adaptation of the effects of climate change is a must if we do not want to exacerbate existing conflicts or jeopardize already achieved development successes. And that's what we have to see, that on one hand, we have a lot of countries where we discuss about getting access to energy. Børge was mentioned it before. We have the three questions of energy security, energy access, and decoupling. But at the end, in a lot of low-income countries, we have to discuss about access to energy. One opportunity is that we can leapfrog the question of not getting access to energy by using fossil fuels, yeah. But at the other side, we have then to think about how to bring it to renewable energies.
Tanja, we lost you there briefly.
Like to ask something?
Yes, Tanja, we lost you briefly there. So if
I'm sorry about that.
No. This is the beauty of hybrids and post-COVID worlds. We will lose signals, and our telecom providers will probably not support us when we need them the most. So I would love it if you could just check your Wi-Fi signal. In the meantime, I'm going to go to Meghan here and ask her, how exactly do we do this? I mean, we've heard lots of people talk about the challenges, all the issues, yes, geopolitics and all of that, but let's talk about solutions at some level. What do we do at this point to make this a reality so that we don't have to have an India, a China, and a US determining where we go. We don't have a US and China bilateral chat on the sidelines of a place where 200 other countries are sitting there wanting equal say. What is a solution that works in the low-income countries, as Tanja was pointing out?
Sure. Well, let me make a few comments and offer some solutions, but as you well know, this isn't a problem that has a solution that works. This is a problem that will have many solutions that are required in order to get us to where we need to go. So 3 things that I think need to happen, just responding to what some of my colleagues have said already. First, Børge, you mentioned that 131 countries have signed up to net zero pledges, and that is something to celebrate, definitely. But very few of them actually have any plan for it. So most of those signed up to net zero commitments by joining a net zero coalition. So it is in rhetoric, but the reality is that very few have plans. Even fewer have those plans actually enshrined in law. It's essentially some European countries. And that is one way of helping in solutions is actually helping these countries get plans, get viable paths to go to net zero. The second thing, and this is obvious, but we haven't used this word yet, surprisingly, is innovation. So if you look at the International Energy Agency, they say that we are currently, collectively, globally, we are investing only 1/3 of what we need to invest in new technologies and in the clean energy economy to get to where we want to go. So even though the numbers you hear are enormous and they're growing quickly, this is still a fraction of where we need to be. So when we think about new technologies, again, this is the International Energy Agency, they tell us that we're pretty good out to 2030. We pretty much have what we need to make the reduction in carbon emissions out to 2030. It's after 2030 that actually half of the emissions that we need to get rid of in the 2030 to 2050 time period will be addressed by technologies that are not yet commercial. So again, we need these significant increases in innovation and R&D. And then thirdly, going to the developing world, I think what's very clear from this conversation is that there has to be a way of squaring the ability to grow with energy future that isn't dominated by fossil fuels. And this, of course, is the big challenge. Either we are able to somehow decouple energy use and GDP, and that's already started to decouple, even though historically, I had an economist tell me that in economics, that is the most strongly related correlation, economic growth and energy use. So trying to decouple that, but then also, trying to help countries build infrastructure in particular that can allow them growth paths that are not dependent on fossil fuels. And this is where we get to the need to meet the commitment that the developed world made to the developing world back in Copenhagen to spend $100 billion a year supporting developing countries in their ambitions to mitigate and also to adapt to climate change. And the fact that that commitment was made for 2020. We're here in 2022, and we have not yet kept that commitment that was made back in 2020. So I think there's a real requirement to do that because, as we were talking about coal plants, the real challenge is either carbon capture, as Børge mentioned, or finding some way that people will retire energy infrastructure, fossil fuel heavy energy infrastructure, before that infrastructure has lived out its commercial life. And that's incredibly hard to do. Like shut down an asset that still has commercial value to opt for another way of doing things. That's just, it's hard to imagine whole societies making that choice unless there are other incentives around it. And I think that's the package that we need to create with financing, with investment in new technologies and all of that.
Mr. Fu, I'm interested in one aspect of this. We keep hearing the word innovation and how it needs to be scaled up and then made reasonably priced so that it can be sent out into the world so we can actually get to the targets that we keep pledging to. But commitment pledges, again, where is the stick? There are lots of carrots, no sticks. When it comes from your perspective as a state-owned enterprise who's doing the green transition, you have the backing, the power, the money, and frankly, less of the pressures that the market would put on you to turn profits. What kind of innovations are getting you excited from a Chinese perspective that are happening where you are that the West is still relatively unaware of? And carbon capture being one of them, but can you run us through some of the innovations that are exciting you?
Actually, this is R&D and technology investment is very critical for the carbon neutrality targets for all the world. And China is true. And it is true to China also. And currently, I think there's two things that I personally and in this country, we see that we emphasize very much on the energy efficiency technology. because the energy efficiency in China is not as high as in your countries, in Western countries, like European countries. We might have almost two and more times higher energy cost or energy lower energy efficiencies than in Europe. So there's a tremendous room to saving energies in this country, but there needs a lot of energy related, the technology related with promoting the energy efficiency. And second, that even though with this, it's not enough, because you know, our fundamental issue is that the primary energy, about 85% of primary energy is from fossil fuels, among which 60% of those are from coal. So this is tremendous large volume of fossil fuel and being consumed. And so in a short period of time, we cannot suddenly cut or turn down a majority of the coals that we consumed, because our economy still need to be a growth. So this might be the coal abandonment will be a slower processes. However, this does not mean that we should continue to discharge of pollutants or CO2s. So CCUS will be another exciting area that we have to develop those technologies and have for fully utilization of CCUS to make us continue or slow down to the coal consumption. Well, but majority of the CO2 discharge will be controlled.
I think my question is more along the lines of, do you really need innovation to happen in the West to make it into the Chinese borders, to make a change, make the transition you need to, or is there already innovation that's happening within China that is making this transition possible and quicker, or are we going to have to wait for you to somehow reach a deal with the Americans to allow for that IP to come your way?
This is not depends on people, and this really depends on the politicians. And we can talk a lot of things, we can propose a lot of things, but actually we just provide the lip service. Actually, the politicians do not pay much attention to what we called, especially between US and China politicians. They are trying to decoupling of the technology cooperation, which is just anti what we really want to do. So this is something we can work more with Europe. I think this is for the carbon pricing or the border tax. I think this is something that we can talk more broadly. However, China will not depend on the Western countries and to provide the technology, but we welcome the technologies from the Western countries, but we have to depend on ourselves. We are not waiting for that. We have to do it immediately.
Tanja, how do we get countries, the low-income countries, to develop the technologies that they need if they need to do it now, and we can't wait for the more advanced technologies in the West to become scalable and cheaper? I mean, do we invest in traditional technologies? It's a question I asked in a previous session, because there are many, many traditional technologies that are available across the world that can just be scaled up where they are. Are you doing work on that front so that the transition doesn't hit these low-income countries as hard?
Yes, obviously we do such things. If you look the development of technologies, especially wind or PV, was quite excellent for now using it. Looking at the African continent, at a lot of African countries, you can use PV in off-grid solutions, so you get very fast access to energy without having problems of transition lines or something like that. So with that, yes, it is. These are solutions also for low-income countries. Second, if you look at the discussions of hydrogen, and that hydrogen will play a crucial role in the future of energy sector. There we have a lot of low-income countries with quite good opportunities to be part of such a hydrogen economy for the future, use it for themselves, but also then maybe be in the future an exporter of hydrogen. And there we try to support them. We are in the discussions how to set up plans for that. How to support them in investing in hydrogen plants. So I think there are opportunities for low-income countries to be part of that, and that's how we try to support them, how we discussed about develop green jobs there, get educated in green jobs, so that they can then be part of especially this new energy economy. And there I think we have a lot of opportunities. And we support a lot of countries at that point, be it Brazil, Chile, be it Morocco, and also South Africa. So there are really good examples how we can really support them so that they can play a crucial role in the future.
Børge, you wanted to come in on that?
No, we're faced with many dilemmas. I think Meghan underlined that International Energy Agency in their report said that by 2030 we can deliver mitigation, but after 2030 we need probably then also breakthroughs to really meet a net zero situation. And if you read the Bill Gates book, it's all about these breakthrough energies. But that demand for those new energies or these new breakthroughs have to be created. And there you have to use the economy. You have either to set a price on carbon, or you have to create the demand from the companies, probably something in between. Then you have to cut out all the subsidies that are pretty disruptive in this context, and you also have to make sure that the 8,500 coal plants in the world at least should be based on the best available technology. They also should have carbon capture and storage in the future. But in many countries, you still see that for every coal plant that is closed, there is built 4 or 5 new ones, and that is not really bringing us on sustainable track. And then we get the question, I guess Meghan get it, I get it also from the World Economic Forum, say, oh, what will these technologies be after 2030? And it's hard to say, because these are scientists, these are like the most creative minds in the world. As long as there is a market and demand for these technologies, they will be developed. If you look at the 10 largest companies in the world today, market cap, 10 largest. For 20 years ago, 7 of them did not exist. So if I then were asked this question 20 years ago, oh, what are the new technologies? What will be most successful companies in the world? I'm pretty sure I couldn't have answered it, but there was a demand, they used it, they were innovative and all this. But all these breakthroughs will not happen if we can't agree globally that we really have to internalize the externalities. There are only global solutions to this global problem. And the price of letting no climate change happen is higher than taking these steps. And in a polarized world, it's going to be even more hard to get consensus on the next steps. And energy is also now used and plays a role in this geopolitical spiel. And of course, if you today are a major energy distributor based on, for example, fuel or energy sources that you want to have less of in the future, you might not be thrilled to be very collaborative in phasing this out. But I would then suggest, rather than be in the forefront in developing the necessary technologies that can also deal maybe with your existing energy sources. The jury is out if that's possible. Let's see.
I want to pick up on the point you made, but again, folks, remember our rule here. We take part in the conversation. So catch my eye, raise your hands, and I will get the mic to you, because this is a critically important conversation, and the fact that Mr. Fu is with us is also critically important to get the perspective straight from China and from a fossil fuel producer on top of that. I think, Meghan, I want to bring this back to you in some ways, going back to what Børge said, is the fact that we have a polarized world. We have two camps at this point that are rebuilding to something of a new Cold War situation. We have issues in the South, we have issues in the West, we have perhaps given too much power to oil producers over the last 30, 40 odd years. How do you start unraveling that at a point at which it's used, as you've all rightly said, and lots of people here have said, it's being used almost like an economic weapon at this point, because the West is going to get distracted, the innovation's not going to happen because the money is going to go elsewhere. How do you square that circle in some ways if we're stuck in that same rhetoric of, yes, we need this, yes, maybe tomorrow, yes, but we have something else going on right now? How do we do that?
Well, I think it comes down to, on the one hand, everyone always says this, on the one hand, leadership, right? Because you need someone who can keep the eye on the short term, but also keep the eye on the long term. And I think this goes back to what Mr. Fu was saying. He kept mentioning the realism. We need to be realistic. And I think this moment in Europe, everybody feels a little shot of realism, but at the same time, they also feel energized about idealism, like energized that one of the ways to avoid the situation that the world is in right now, where a traditional fossil fuel producer is exerting enormous geopolitical power because of this gap between supply and demand in energy. There are two ways to address it. One is you could up the supply of fossil fuels, and part of the conversation in Europe today is just, well, we recognize we're going to need more gas in the short term, and that's realism. And the real challenge there is, how do you get companies to invest in infrastructure knowing that this is a short-term thing, not a long-term thing, even though these investments are traditionally long-term? And then the other part is, well, we could either up supply or we could decrease demand. And that's the efficiency piece, and also increase alternative energy. So I think the reality is, how can you do two things at the same time which seem contradictory? And this, I think, demands a real improvement in the way the public conversation about the energy transition, so people can hold ideas that seem contradictory in their head at the same time. But I also think, going back to Børge's point about, the price of doing nothing is high, but people have come to expect, because many leaders have told them this, that the energy transition doesn't have to be expensive. Well, it is going to be expensive in some ways. It will bring improvements, for sure, but there is going to be expense associated with it. And I don't think that's part of the public lexicon, at least coming from the United States where I do. Part of the selling of the energy transition is that it can be done for cheaper, because look at how wind and solar, the prices have come down. And I think there needs to be more realism in the conversation, that we do have to pay some price for an improved product, essentially. It's that simple.
Børge, that brings up the point, right? I mean, we're talking in headline news of fuel poverty this whole winter for obvious reasons. Households dealing with the implications of that on their food pricing. Energy, as we know, translates into so many elements of the economy. When people are absolutely terrified about switching the heat on and having their children freezing. Thankfully, it's been a warm winter, but There are places in Europe where it has been freezing cold. Is this a time that they're going to care that their children's world is going to come to an end, or are they going to think more about, my children need to eat dinner tonight and stay warm? How do you communicate that clearly, that Mr. Fu's job is going to soon transition into a green company, but it's going to take a while, as he said, realistically. In the meantime, we need Mr. Fu's product very, very clearly.
Was that to me?
That's to you.
Oh, thank you. We should not then forget that last summer we had the floods in Germany. We had the wildfires in California. We have droughts. We have also rough weather. And then that was in focus. Of course, at this time now, there is focus on the electricity prices in Europe, and that I fully understand. I think, though, that over time, is more realistic that we can solve the energy access in Europe and in other countries than we can solve by adaptation the challenges that climate change will create. I think the price you will pay as a planet for the climate change is unbearable. I think when we have achieved what we have achieved on our planet so far, we will be able, as long as we can agree on some parameters, we will be able to have the necessary breakthroughs. Of course, we have to then be willing to pick the low-hanging fruits first and show the willingness there, not currently happening. But over time, I think this is possible. We can send things to Mars. 100 years ago, the biggest environmental problem in London was the horses. So I'm like a technology optimist, but the technology will not come on its own. There has to be incentive for private sector to do so. And I think the vaccines is just a reminder how powerful public-private partnerships are. Who would have thought that in less than a year we got effective vaccines against COVID-19? Usually it takes a decade, and there are some diseases there are not yet a vaccine against. So this happened through a lot of money on the table and then the private sector delivering. This has to also happen when it comes to energy. So is that?
Mr. Fu, I think the question here that always arises when we say that we've got to do it because it's an urgent situation. In the West, young people are driving us to ensure that policies change, whether we like it or not. I think politicians have had to listen to them because that's become a massive movement. In China, are you seeing a similar push from young people, or is it still a bit of a debate of, as you mentioned, economic prosperity, wanting the same things as young people in the West, the privilege, or choosing climate and their future over all of that? What is going on? What is the driver for you? You're on mute. I love saying that after COVID. Mr. Fu, you're on mute.
Sorry. I believe more or less the same. Because the youngsters, they are looking the tomorrow's world's more optimistic than us. So they are try to driving the current situation to change as far as possible. For example, the green energy in China, and in the past years, grow very fast, including this wind power and solar power. You need the capacity, installing capacity each year, just unbelievable that they have so much capacity being built each year. And just take an example of e-car. And the e-car, you know, in the last 10 years, the total e-car manufactured and sold about 4 million. But last year alone, almost 4 million, just 1 year. So those making the people, especially young people, love those things. They are pushing forward to protect the environment and also to tackling the climate change. I think they are one of the strong forces to make the change of today, especially in China. But because our remaining capacity of fossil fuels is still very large, even though we grow very fast in green energy, but still we need to take some time to transform the traditional large-scale fossil fuels, fossil energy, to the new clean energy by 20, 40 years.
Thank you for that. We also lost your picture, but we can see your waving hand. I do love Zoom. We have a question right there.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is a really great discussion. I'm Stormy Miltner. I'm with the Aspen Institute, Germany. I wanted to pick up on the issue of global value chain security for metals and minerals, especially rare earth, but also bring in the issue of semiconductors. And 2 years ago, the motto of the Munich Security Conference was Westlessness. And when I'm looking at the last G7 summit, it was a great summit, and value chain security or supply chain security was important in there, but it was a little bit disappointing when it came down to cooperation on what really to do, especially also on metals and minerals. It seems to be that in the end, we perceive each other as competitors. We are not so great at sharing data, vulnerabilities, and so on. So my question is not how to overcome helplessness in this area, but how to get back to Westlessness and cooperate on supply chain security better.
Who would like to take that first?
Professor?
Well, I'll leave plenty of room for you to come in on the semiconductor thing. I think it's, first of all, it's a great question. And I do think that there are real parallels with the semiconductor thing with how we think about critical minerals. So not just rare earth, but also the critical minerals, the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, those things that we know will need 6 to 8 times the amount that's currently being produced globally in order to meet some of these ambitions we have on the energy transition front. And here, I think there are going to have to be a number of solutions. And a couple of things I think are rising to the fore. I'm actually just about to co-chair an Aspen strategy, or an Aspen Institute task force on critical minerals. So if you ask me in 6 or 8 months, I might have better answers. But for the moment right now, I think it's inevitable that there'll be, in the short to medium term, a certain amount of nearshoring or ally shoring. I think there's a very clear sense of vulnerability on the part of countries that don't have direct access. I think there's people are looking at how China has made a lot of strategic investments, kind of got out ahead in front of the critical minerals issue much earlier than a lot of other Western countries. And so I think, there's probably going to be an effort to see what can be recreated to, like other supply chains, so that there's more resiliency in the supply chain. The thing is, this is harder because it is not a manufactured good that could be manufactured anywhere. This is a critical mineral, which is actually found in more parts of the world than is currently produced, but there are real obstacles to rapidly producing it in other places. The thing which I put more hope in over the medium term is the whole question of recycling and developing alternative materials. And so you asked earlier the question about what technologies should we look for are exciting, and we've talked about some of them. One that we haven't talked about is this capacity to recycle these critical minerals or to substitute for them. And I think that is going to be essential. I think there's, I've been told that there's some real promising steps that have been taken. The challenge is making these processes commercial, making them economically sensible. But I think we'll have to get there. Otherwise, the energy transition will be held hostage to this one issue. And it can also be used as a real geopolitical tool. It won't have the same impact as an oil embargo because it's an input into something greater, but it will have a very similar impact to the semiconductor thing. It can frustrate things, it can slow things down, it can disrupt. And that certainly comes with a measure of geopolitical influence.
Børge?
I can subscribe to everything Meghan said, very thoughtful. And it's a reminder that resilience has not been so much focused on when it comes to either semiconductors or rare minerals. I think we've become much more vigilant on this now. Is it too late? I don't think so. Of course, there are the whole thing with circular economy, also substitutes will play a role. On semiconductors, it's strange that this debate just came up now. The reality is that 90% of all semiconductors do come from Taiwan and South Korea. So no, we have a discussion in the US. There's going to be big money on the table for starting production in the US. 35 billion euros is now proposed from the Commission to make also Europe more competitive here. I think it's coming back to also the point about we have to be willing to pay over time a bit higher of a price for energy if we're going to solve the climate challenge. Because maybe later on it can be cheaper, but when you introduce the new sources, it's going to have a higher price. I think also short, medium term, the partly nearshoring or building in resilience when it comes not only to minerals, semiconductors, maybe it's also fertilizers, maybe it's food, the whole value chain there. But I think that price is probably something that we should be willing to pay, and we should have a policy for it. You know, no one has a house and don't have insurance on the house. And I think we have not been willing to pay the necessary insurance premium here. But it's important that we don't lose the baby with the bathwater, because at the same time, the globalization and using the comparative advantages is what have built the current prosperity, and is the reason why we have moved from 5 billion people in 1990 to 7 billion now. And in 1990, there was like 40% that lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's like maybe 10%. So then they say, oh, globalization increases the differences. Yeah, maybe it does in some industrialized countries that are not willing to use the tools you can use to address that. But overall, globalization has been really a prerequisite for the poverty eradication that you have seen many places in the world. But everything has to be balanced, and one of the balancing factors has also to be that we look at resilience there.
Well, one of the important parts of when we talk about rare earths comes back down to your SDGs S. It's about the people who are mining. So, Tanja, if you can run us through, how do you deal with the issues when we're talking about renewable energy? Are you involved in any way in trying to help or support the people in the regions that are mining for these rare earths? They do end up getting into a rather tight situation as the demand rises. How are you balancing that from your perspective? And then we have two questions from our audience that I'm going to get to.
Well, thank you so much, because I think, yes, if we look at the sustainable value chain, we have to have clear where minerals are coming from and how the situation is there. And we are involved in some projects where we try to bring together the interests of the people, also the interests of the environment, because look at cobalt in Africa. It's quite in an artisanal way how they build up the resources, and that's not sustainable for the long way. And we try to support them to balance between the interests of the people, the income for people, sustainability, and also how to be part of the market for the future. So yes, we try to do that. It's not easy, because as often, and Børge mentioned it before, to balance the different things, to think about sustainability is in a lot of countries not in the front because they would like to get an economic increasing. They will increase their economy, be part of a middle income. And there we have to deal with that, yes, we support countries. We also support with projects, especially these questions, because I think only with that we will be then able really to achieve the SDGs all over the world, and not only in the industrialized countries, but also in the developing countries.
Thank you for that, Tanja. Let's get our questions in. We have a good 12 minutes to go for our questions. So the first one from the back.
Thank you. My name is Ricardo. I'm a member of parliament in Portugal and president of Unite, which is a global network of members of Congress, Senates, and parliaments committed to ending infectious diseases as a global health threat. And planetary health, of course, is an important issue in the crossroads of health and climate change. And I fully agree with the example that was given on the development of the vaccine against COVID-19. But it really took the world to halt as a whole to get the money where it was needed to develop that innovation. In contrast, we've been dealing with the HIV and AIDS pandemic for 40 years, and we haven't been able to put the same resources to getting a vaccine. So the question here is, we've been hearing about the importance of innovation and getting that innovation out there when it comes to dealing with climate. What do we need to do more? And from your different perspectives, from academia, from businesses, from the development world, what do we need to do to gain that level of urgency that will help us push to the next level? Thank you.
Shall we start with the person who is most likely to give us a round answer, an academic?
Well, okay. I don't know if that's a good reason to start with me. And I share the desire to see this continue to rise to the top of the agenda. And I think, as Børge's opening comments did suggest, this is much more frequent than it was a short time ago, so there has been progress in that direction. I would say, talking less as a professor and more as an American and a former policymaker, our big challenge is to figure out how we can insulate this issue from a phrase that someone else used, the yo-yo of American politics. And that, I think, is what the real challenge from the American perspective is. But if America can't get its act together and in the game, then all of us globally are hurt by this. So I think that is one of the real challenges from our perspective, is to get this out of the partisan politics, out of the yo-yo of American politics, to be something that is more, consistent and more, more shared. I also think, you asked the question about what happens when people have competing priorities as individuals or families and they want food on the table. Going back to my, former policymaker in national security hat, I'm worried about what we're seeing today when international security, foreign policy crises bubble to the front if they're seen as being contradictory with pursuit of climate goals. I feel like climate goals are always going to lose out. So this is one of the reasons why making this investment in managing the geopolitics up front matters a lot for the success of the climate endeavors. Because if we can be less distracted by these things, there'll be more room on the global agendas for climate consistency.
Mr. Fu, could you also take that question on, please, and give us an idea of what it will take to get that sense of urgency from a Chinese perspective?
I think in terms of the technology investment or R&D investment, but I would like to emphasize that the technology cooperation, especially between the developed and developing countries, and in the most of the developing countries, they don't have enough capacity, especially don't have enough finance investment in the technology side. And in this regard, I think the developed countries, they need to keep their promise to financing the developing countries in dealing with the climate change. And before the or during the Paris Accord, Paris conference, I think there's developed countries have made a commitment to give a finance support. This including the technology, not a transfer cooperation. And but in my aspect, I think there's other areas that I need to remind that little gentleman that there's another thing that really have a negative impact of our efforts for the carbon neutrality. That is that the technology that developed by China, like solar technology, modules, facilities, equipment, and when we sell to the European market, the US market, it was imposed a higher tax, or even they stopped this. I think this is not a good thing for the technology cooperation. I think we need to talk more about it because it's the most advanced technology and the most cost-effective technology. I think that can be applied all the world to develop more green energy than the fossil fuels.
But Tanja and Børge, yeah, can I get you, Tanja, very quickly? We're running out of time and we've got 2 more questions that I want to try and squeeze in, if I can.
Well, very quickly, I think one answer is to fulfill our commitments we did. And to go into cooperation, we have to be in an honest cooperation with developing countries. And looking at the vaccination issue, to be honest, I think we should be honest. Yes, there was developed very fast vaccine, but at the end, half of the world has now a booster, and half of the world doesn't have the first vaccination. And we have to be very keen that we are honest in cooperation also with developing countries and go into a really good partnership with them in capacity building, in financing, and only with that I'm pretty sure we will be successful.
Børge?
So, as I mentioned in my introduction, the discussion about climate change used to also be about why. We should not underestimate that can come back because of social media and some polarization, but mainly no, it's about how. And then the next step is when we have the commitments is compliance and concrete plans on the commitments. And that is still lagging a bit behind, as Meghan also touched on. But there has been major movements in the right direction because we are also seeing that companies are starting to really walk the talk here. Companies setting 2030 net zero, 2040, 2050, and they see that if they're going to be attractive also for the most talented people in the future, they have to take the ESGs and climate really, really seriously. So I feel there is a big change in the zeitgeist and in the feeling around this, and I think private sector will play a major role here. And of course, if you see more of the money being invested and allocated in non-fossil fuel areas, money do talk, and that will have major impact. But it's not a linear way forward, definitely not, because what we've seen lately with the energy prices in Europe, the energy blackouts has led to many coal-fired power plants being opened again. So I think it's going to be back and forth. Yeah. But as long as we can see 2 steps forward and 1 back, I think we can live with it. As a planet, we cannot live with the situation if it's 1 step forward and 2 back. Then we have a planet that will be on fire in some decades.
2 questions
let
to
me
wrap up.
Let me have one more comment. I think the developed countries need to make more action, not just talking about this. And in the case like in China. China has provided more than 1 billion vaccine to the developing countries already. But we see when every country, especially in the Western countries, they also have impact by the vaccine, by the COVID-19, but they are focusing on themselves. They first protect themselves, and they did too less and to the developing countries. So China, I think we are not just protecting our own people, we also try the best to helping the developing countries as best we can do. Thank you.
I think that's a good, valid point about the soft power that is being spread that we all talk about, whether it be China's vaccines or whether it be Russia's offer of mercenary services in the Sahel. That's been debated quite a bit here at the MSC. We have 30 seconds left, unfortunately. So what I am going to do is give the last word to our two fellows. If I can get you both to make your comments and give us your question, and I will eat into your coffee break again with 1 minute answers from all our speakers.
Question to Meghan about a supply chain issue that Chairman Fu also alluded to, the recent American ban on imports from Xinjiang, and there's European legislation underway that would probably have the same effect. Since so much of global solar production or solar cell production is in Xinjiang, how disruptive will that be in terms of solar rollout in the US, for example?
And the second question as well, please. It's from the gentleman in the red tie.
I just wanted to ask one question about what do you think will be the utilities of the future look like? Mr. Børge mentioned that in London the biggest problem in the past was the horses. Are we trying to now ask the horse guys to build BMW, or would it be a different companies, different utilities that will come in the future with innovation?
So an innovation question, and to you, Meghan, first.
Okay, you raise a very good point, and one that certainly policymakers are aware of. When I have asked this direct question to many, the answer that I have received, or to some, has been, well, that production capability will have to move out of Xinjiang. I don't know how realistic that is, but that is, I think, the hope and expectation. Let me just finish, I know I only get a moment, by saying this points to a broader issue, I think, about overall, if the energy transition were the #1 priority of the world, we wouldn't be having all this protectionist measures popping up around all different things. But in fact, we do, and countries are going to have other priorities. They're going to have human rights priorities, very prominent in the energy debate and energy technologies is this whole idea about building up domestic manufacturing capabilities, making renewable energy actually a fuel for domestic economies. And this might be good for domestic economies, but it slows down the overall energy transition and frustrates it. So that's just a balance, I think, that we're going to have to be sensitive to.
If I can give the second question to all three of the remaining panelists. Technologies of the future driven by companies that are already there, or companies that have been existent for 125 years, companies that are being bankrolled by governments, or is it going to be a whole new breed? What are you looking at from your perspective? Tanja, I'm going to give it to you first.
Well, thank you so much. I think one of the new technologies will be the hydrogen, but I'm not able to answer how will be foreseen the next utility. But I think hydrogen will a solution also for all questions of energy access. Second, I think we have to have clear that we need cooperation and cooperation, a sense of partnership in the next years. And I think we are in front of a decade of action. Without action, we will not be successful in achieving net zero. And I think we have to trust in technology. We have to trust in market-related solutions. And then I'm pretty sure that we will be able to achieve something in the short, but especially in the midterm. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Tanja. Mr. Fu, are you going to continue to develop all of these new technologies and in 5 years still be chairman at the China Petroleum and Chemical Corporation, or do you think you'll be heading something completely innovative and different, and that's going to drive the change that China needs?
I'm not the chairman of this company already, but I think all the China companies will focus a lot on the investment of the new technologies in the next 5 to 10 years. And technology is very, very important for our goals of carbon neutrality. And second is the investment, the financial investment in the industries, especially in the new energy industry like solar and solar and even hydrogen. So those areas will be focused by the Chinese business communities and certainly will be strongly supported by the government policies.
Børge, I give you the last word. Where are we going? Which companies? Who's going to be at WEF getting the white badge?
Yeah. So I think I tried to answer this already with saying that for me it's critical to establish the demand for technologies that either are net zero or are decoupling energy growth from CO2 emissions. When that is in place, I'm pretty sure that the market will deliver what is necessary. If you have just seen what we have, what artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, only those two technologies in itself has also reduced the energy need and has increased the smartness of the grids quite substantially during the last years. So I'm a technology optimist, but I'm not optimistic that these technologies will be developed by the private sector, that will have to drive it together, of course, with massive governmentally funded research and development if there is not a demand for these technologies. And there, either you have to set a price on carbon, or you have to establish other mechanisms and then phase out fossil fuel subsidies and etc. So that framework has to be in place. And then you can say, how will you do competitive-wise if you're a late mover or a fast mover? I believe in being a fast mover here, both for companies and for nations. If you're early on, I think you will be more competitive and prosperous later on. That is my view, and I think we will see that documented in the coming 2 decades.
So this partnership is what we've been hearing and talking about for 2 days, and thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask you a cheeky question before I let you all go. Will fossil fuel companies be welcome at WEF this spring?
So indeed, we will have also hard-to-abate sector there. If we are going to be serious on reducing the CO2 emissions, we cannot say that all the hard-to-abate sectors, aluminium, steel, fossil fuel-based companies are not welcome. We welcome them very much. That's why we also have established a Mission Possible initiative. We have 435 companies in the hard-to-abate sector that will be in Davos the 21st of May. But we don't want them there to continue on the path they are. They should commit to go net zero in the future.
On that note, thank you very much for answering a cheeky question. And thank you very much for giving me a little bit more of your time from your coffee break. I've been kind of stealing your time all day. So thank you, and a round of applause to these wonderful people. We'll see you back here a little after 1:30 p.m.